Hello, this is the Vice President of Internet Infidels, Edward Tahmizian. You all know me for my published paper on the origin of evil and theistic art determinism. And today, for the sixth time, we're going to be interviewing the one, the only, the great and legendary King of the Christ myth theorist, Dr. Richard Carrier. And before we begin the questions, I'll have
Hello.
him do his self-promotion and talk about his life. And so the chair is yours, Carrier, so take it away.
Yeah, so this week in Georgia, we're dealing with ice storms. So it's
Georgia!
pretty cold. Yeah, in
And
Atlanta. Yeah, we had full snow, ice storms, a lot of car wrecks outside our house. It was
shoot.
quite a lot going on. Yeah, so yeah, of course, I'm Richard Carrier, PhD, Columbia University, doctorate in ancient history. I'm known for a lot of things, not just the historicity of Jesus, but counter apologetics, philosophy of naturalism, ancient science, like all kinds of. I have my fingers in a lot of pies, a lot of different publications. People who want to like follow my work on any of those subjects or all of them can find it at richardcarrier.info. That's .info. And that's all things me. You can find my social media there. Follow me on Blue Sky now. I've just gotten on Blue Sky, or my other places, or become a Patreon patron, or take. I have online correspondence courses I teach that you can do. You can also check out my books, my recommendations, and so much more. And so I think today our main thing is going to be well, counter apologetics, I guess, because we're going to do some history, and then like there's one philosophical question I think you got coming.
Oh yeah, yeah. I made sure to make a good list of interesting questions. I thought of
Yeah.
them like about 4 days
It's
ago. I was like, hey,
yeah,
these are
yeah,
pretty
I
good.
saw those. You sent those just a bit ago, and I realized like some of those are hot questions. Like they're coming up on the internet now a lot. So you're in the zone, I have to say.
Yeah, no, it'll be beneficial for both of our audiences. Alrighty, so diving into our first question. Some Christian apologists think that one of the reasons one should believe in the miraculous claims mentioned in the New Testament is due to the fact that the four canonical Gospels were written 25 to 50 years later after the death of Jesus. So, since these are not miracle accounts that come way later, like in the case with Alexander the Great and Apollonius of Tyana, like only about 100 or so years after they died, did miraculous claims kind of surround, their history, the, regular history surrounding them. So the Christians are like, hey, we can trust in the gospel accounts because, if it's earlier, that's less time for myth and legend to have accumulated. So there's a greater chance that the miracle claims are true. So what would you say to all this?
Yeah, so this is an old one. It's an oldie but goodie. That I debunked this years ago. William Lane Craig was pushing this argument. And you can find people who are interested in it, but want to get the full skinny, because we can just do a brief here. Is my article on my website is no, Mr. Christian, A.N. Sherwin White didn't say that. And even what he did say was wrong. Because Sherwin White is the one that this goes back to, supposedly. But William Lane Craig misrepresented what Sherwin White said, and what Sherwin White said was also wrong. It's provably wrong. Uh, the We have tons of examples of ridiculous, wild claims arising very quickly throughout history, but even in antiquity, we have examples of this. So it isn't the case that I mean, it's true. It's the case that if you have gospels that were first written and they don't cite sources or anything like that, and they're 100, 200 years later, 300 years later, yeah, you can dismiss those outright. Even if they had nothing miraculous in them, they would be useless data. Um, but the problem is that the nearness of the Gospels, the earliest Gospels arrive about 40 to 50 years after Christianity began, and that's half a century, which back then was an average lifespan. So we're talking like a lot of people have died before that. Like it's kind of like saying a claim was made 100 years ago here today, and you think like 100 years ago, like of course legendary developments can arise that fast, right? Um, Even 50 years, even 40 years. So a classic example is the Roswell flying saucer claim. So we went from it's sticks and tinfoil in the desert, fully documented with photographs, everything. Sticks and tinfoil goes all the way to a complete intact alien spaceship with alien bodies being autopsied by the government within 40 years. So yeah, you can have these ridiculous stories arise very quickly in this time scales that the Gospels are on. But they can even happen faster than that. Like legends and ridiculous stories can arise almost immediately. We know this because urban legends are an example of this. Like urban legends talk about some crazy thing that happened last year or 5 years ago or whatever, and they're just ridiculous. They're unsourced and aren't true. And so we have a lot of examples like that. And we have, we have a whole treatise on this by Lucian of Samosata called Lover of Lies, where he just goes around talking to people, telling him crazy stories, and they're all things that they claim to have seen or that happened during their lifetime, but they're all ridiculous and obviously false. And so his point being is like, you can't trust this stuff, right? Like, so anyway, the point being is that argument doesn't work, right? So no, it doesn't hold up. And anybody who wants to dive into that further, I give examples in that article I just mentioned, and in other articles that I've written on my blog about other miracle claims, like the rain miracle of Marcus Aurelius, where we have a similar timeline from it becoming embellished into a ridiculous story from something that was more mundane. And we have other examples like that.
Like the one we're about to get into. About
Right.
Josephus and the Jewish War. Yeah, all right, yeah. Excellent point, Carrier. Yeah, and actually, I was reading online about some guy. He has allegedly one of the top 50 atheist websites, blogs about like, analyzing the veracity of miracle claims. And he talks about some of the stuff that Herodotus writes about 40 or 50 years later when he's talking about the Battle of Marathon and how there was one person who saw like this phantasmal apparition of like this large soldier or whatever, and he like was trying to get across that it was an authentic claim because he heard it from some guy named Aphilius or something like that. Like yeah, you can have miracle claims pretty early too. And going into our second question, which deals probably with the greatest of them all outside of the New Testament, is the claims that Josephus makes when recounting the Jewish War. So he mentions a bunch of miracles that occurred during the Roman Jewish War, and Josephus is including these claims of the miraculous merely 10 years after they allegedly occurred, and he was writing in the genre of history as well. So, why do you think his record? What do you think of his record, and why do you doubt he was telling the truth? And before you give us your answer, I will read the just a short excerpt from the
Yeah,
Jewish
good.
War so people know what we're talking about. Okay, so
Yeah.
Josephus says, during the same feast, a cow brought by someone to be sacrificed gave birth to a lamb in the middle of the temple courts. While at midnight it was observed that the east gate of the inner sanctuary had opened of its own accord, a gate made of bronze and so solid that every evening 20 strong men were required to shut it, fastened with iron bars and secured by bolts which were lowered a long lane to a threshold fashioned from a single slab of stone. The temple guards ran with the news to the captain, who came up and by a great effort managed to shut it. This, like the others, seemed to the lady to be of omens. A few days after the feast, on the 21st Artemiosios, a supernatural apparition was seen, too amazing to be believed. What I have to relate would, I suppose, have been dismissed as an invention had it not been vouched for eyewitnesses. So eyewitnesses recounted this allegedly, and followed by disasters that bore out the signs. Before sunset, there were seen in the sky over the whole country chariots and regiments, and arms speeding through the clouds and encircling the towns, and again, at the feast of Pentecost, when the priest had gone into the inner temple at night to perform the usual ceremonies, they declared that they were aware, first of a violent movement, and then a loud crash, and then a concreted cry, "Let us go hence." So, what do you think of Josephus's claims, and why don't you believe he was telling the truth about the miracles? Take it away.
Yeah. We have similar things that we don't have to just count on biblical religions. So hundreds of years before, Herodotus does this too, where he says, I met some people who saw a mass resurrection of cooked fish, and I saw some people who saw winged snakes. Like we have examples of this out in other religious traditions. You can find it in the sort of miracle accounts in Hinduism and in modern. You have a whole thing in modern India where you have the rationalist societies fighting against gurus trying to create false stories or basically conning people into thinking they're doing miracles and stuff. And the truth is that especially the 20th century, we had a really strong movement from as early as Harry Houdini all the way up to James Randi and Joe Nichols, a very important researcher, Massimo Polidoro, and there are other researchers, James Underdown, for example, currently at CFI Los Angeles, where they've accumulated a lot of examples of what happens when you actually are able to check claims like that. every single time it falls apart. And now how it falls apart differs. Sometimes the claim is an urban legend. And this we have the book The Vanishing Hitchhiker goes into how urban legends get invented and spread rapidly. And this is very much like urban legends, right? And you notice like Josephus never names any witness, so he doesn't put anyone on the spot here. He just claims they're witnesses. And it's not clear that he ever talked to those witnesses. He's just reporting that there were witnesses. So he was told that there were witnesses, right? So this is how this kind of telephone game allows this to happen.
Yeah.
But when you research these urban legends, when you research these miracle claims, you find they're either made up, that they don't have any basis, or you find that they go back to some mundane thing that's been exaggerated over time, or you find that they were a con, right? Like, and I think when Josephus is relating, like one of the things he relates is the people saw soldiers marching in the sky, right? Like, so I'll bet that was just people saw something peculiar in the sky and over time that got evolved into, oh, it was soldiers, right? Like, so it was like, oh, it was a sign that I took as indicating that war is coming, and then that got changed after Trident after Trident after Trident. It became they saw soldiers in the sky, right? So that's the kind of thing that I think is another thing that can happen too. And but you look at some of the others he's talking about, what the cross species birth, just impossible. We know that didn't happen. But that is the kind of thing that priests would pull off a stunt to try, like the gurus of India, to like sell a point. Like they have a political point they want to make, so they forge a miracle, or what would be in this case an omen, to illustrate this. And similar with the voice and the doors spontaneously opening, like we know those things didn't really happen, but someone might have staged them on purpose. But it's also entirely possible these are made up stories, and in fact they might have been made up long after. So like Josephus is writing this years later after the event. So like he's talking about like supposed portents of the Jewish war. But after the Jewish war, when people are trying to explain the tragedy of what happened, that's when you get these urban legends get spun out. People, well, there were all these signs. We should have seen it coming, and then you get more and more people invent signs that they saw. Then, of course, they didn't. And another thing that we have on this is the Loftus studies. Elizabeth Loftus and others have found that human memory is extremely unreliable and does this. They fabricate things. We have the invisible gorilla phenomenon, but we have the opposite of that, where people like the Mandela effect and stuff, where people actually absolutely are sure they remember something happening that absolutely did not happen, and you can document, you can go and check with records and show that it did not happen. Your memory's wrong. You changed your memory over time. And this is how these stories get spun out and exaggerated or even invented. And so when we in the 20th century, when we found that all claims like this end up that way, like all of them, is never an exception. When we look back at Josephus, where we can't do those investigations, we can't send Joe Nickel in, so to go check, right? Like we don't have access to it. We have to base our assessment on what has happened when we can check, and consistently 100% of the time when we can check it, it always doesn't pan out. So that's how we know we can't trust what Josephus is saying. Like he's describing things that are impossible, and therefore we know they didn't happen. And so you would need much better evidence than someone said in order to believe that they really happened.
Yeah, that's another thing. Like, my theory is that, like, after the Jewish wars, I'm sure, like, the pagans are like, hey, what if the Jewish God doesn't exist? And the Jews are like, oh, did God abandon us or something? So Josephus is trying to, like, make up this scenario where it's like, well, actually, our God does exist, and it's not that he's a failure, too weak to guard against the pagans. Like, there were all these signs, and he just invents all
That's
these
right.
signs happening in the
Yes.
past, trying to and warn people to get out of the Jerusalem, like, let us depart hence, and we didn't really figure out what
Or
the meaning of was
yes.
from angels until the end. We're like,
And
oh,
depart
that's what let
depart
us
from your
depart hence means.
disastrous, yeah, depart from your disastrous decisions as well. Yeah, like that. Yeah, that's absolutely you've got it. That's exactly what's going on, and that's also why Josephus wants to tell these stories, and so he's inclined to believe them, or even if he himself doesn't believe them, he's inclined to sell them as true, right? So he has that agenda, and there have been a lot of authors who've studied Josephus's agenda and why we can't trust him a lot of the time. Josephus is not a terribly reliable historian.
Yeah. Alrighty. Going into our third question. This one's the most interesting one we have here. I think you're going to get a kick out of this, Carrier. So there is a common trend amongst some Calvinist Christians where they will claim that, even in a system of divine determinism, though God is merely the final cause of sin, Even if he were to be the efficient or direct cause of people willingly sinning, he would still be infinitely holy and pure, because according to divine command theory, God is good for merely doing what his nature is inclined to do, even if it involves being the author of moral evil. Consider this passage from page 6 from Calvinism and the Problem of Evil, edited by David E. Alexander and Daniel M. Johnson. So just to give a brief background on what's on that page. So either David E. Alexander or Daniel M. Johnson, one of them's writing the preface. So they're like, hey, we often get the author of evil charge against us as Calvinists. So here, Christians, here's some way you can use an apologetic against people who have objections against
Yeah.
Calvinism. So then they come to the port where they say, the second response that you could get is to deny that it is objectionable for the property to attach to God, claim that it wouldn't be contrary to God's goodness, even if God did cause sin, for instance. So they're like, even if he's the efficient cause of people willingly sinning, he's holy, and if he's the final cause, he's holy. So either way, both bases are covered. So God could directly
Yeah.
harden someone and literally make them sin and be morally blameless. What say you to this, Richard?
Yeah. I have an article called Why Theology is Ridiculous. So people can check that. It's not about this, it's about some other ridiculous thing. Theology is ridiculous for a lot of reasons. And one of it is what's happening here that you just described, right? So, like, they've got them tied in knots, like weird, bizarre, convoluted semantic knots, using weird words, like weird concepts like sin and pure and all. And like, what do those things even mean? What does it even have to do with the issue? And so these are all like metaphysical concepts that have no real significance. There's no empirical way that you could verify any of them. They're not even well defined. So it's just a bunch of hand waving to make all this stuff go away. And then the second one that you mentioned is basically, I know how to solve this problem. Let's just redefine evil as good. Done. Then God's always good. He could do all the evil he wants, but evil is good, so it's great, right?
As long as you're God.
And that's what that did, right? Yeah, to cut through this is that you throw away all of their bullshit. I'm not buying any of your words. Your words are stupid. I'm not buying any of your definitions. They're all wrong. I'm going to use ordinary language that refers to ordinary things that everybody's aware of and can understand. And so you go back right to the question is, can God be compassionate if he doesn't act compassionately? The answer is no. And can God be just if he doesn't act justly, etc.? And then, of course, there's a different apologetic where they'll try to say, well, God is forced or whatever, he's limited or whatever the thing is. Of course, that creates other problems. But the excuses you're saying now don't work because God is all powerful and he's invincible, so you can't hurt him. So he can't refrain from doing good out of fear of being harmed, right? He doesn't have limited resources, so he has to conserve his money, right? Like he has no limitations that we have that are our excuses for the things sometimes we can't intervene to prevent injustices or evils because we are limited. We're limited in our resources. We might not be good. There's a lot of reasons that we have that don't apply to God, right? So that's the main problem is that God doesn't have those excuses. And so the question is, so for instance, if we look at the world and we assume God exists, then we can assume actions of God. Because if God exists and what we observe in the world reflects God's actions, right? So if he refrains to do something, that's an action. If he does do something, like if a tsunami kills 100,000 people in Indonesia, God did something. Even if he didn't cause that thing, he caused all the physics and all the situation, the tectonics, everything that would have led to that. And he didn't intervene. So he set up the whole thing that was going to do it. He saw it coming. He did nothing. He didn't even warn people, nothing. So if you assume God exists, you have to own God's actions then. So they say like, now we can observe God's actions on your assumption that God exists. And we say like, well, I don't see, God is not acting virtuously. He's not acting compassionately. He's not acting justly. He's not acting honestly. He's not acting helpfully. He does not possess any of the virtues that define a person as morally good. In ordinary human dialect, right? Like what do we mean when we say someone is good? We mean they have the virtues. They're virtuous and they're consistent in abiding by those virtues. But the evidence is that God doesn't do that, so he cannot have those virtues. And therefore, you can talk about, oh, well, that means, I mean, that's just his nature to not have those virtues, or that's still not a sin to not have those virtues. It's like, I don't care. I don't care about your stupid words. All I care about is he virtuous? And the answer is no. And that's it. We're done, right? There's nowhere to go from there. And I've done some recent articles like the last couple months on attempts to get around this. There's this massive convoluted list of possible ways for them to like be Luke Skywalker clinging to the thing in the Cloud City yelling, no, that's impossible, and like coming up with some ridiculous excuse to try and get away from this. But the excuses always end up being ridiculous. And that's why when you see that like convoluted, weird use of words, just no. Let's go to what we're really talking about. We're talking, is God virtuous? Basic, ordinary, recognized virtues as to what people mean, ordinary people mean by goodness. They mean compassionate, they mean honest, they mean all these things. And do we have any evidence that God is that? No, we have no evidence of it. In fact, we have abundant evidence that he's not those things. So you can call that good if you want. So you can change evil into good and just call evil good, but we have your number. We know you're
Semantically, it's the
doing that, right?
same,
Like, it's just
yeah.
not going to work. Yeah, it's not
Good
going to
loses
convince
all its
us. You're not going
meaning.
to trick us, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, changing the names of things is not going to trick us. We know you can't change what a thing is by changing what you call it. So you can't get out of this. So that kind of thing only makes sense in the convoluted, bizarre metaphysical worldview they've stuck themselves in. But in the real world where the rest of us live, it doesn't work. It doesn't make sense at all.
Yeah, and the way to get around this is you have to think like not just what the standard of good is. Like, is it grounded in God's nature? Is it grounded in what's feasible for society to carry out? It rather you have to. Well, that's an important question, but rather you have to go to what's the ontology of good? Like, what is its representative nature? And to whatever the standard is, to be good means to be
Yeah,
opposed to evil, and being the efficient cause of people willingly sinning is being for evil, not against it. Therefore, he'd be evil if he causes sin. Therefore, the hyper
yeah.
Calvinist argument goes out the door.
That's right. Yeah, and
It's
it
simple,
comes down
right?
to what you mentioned there is even if you grant a metaphysics, like, oh, it's grounded in his nature. But the question is not whether it's grounded in his nature or not. The question is, what is his nature? Right? So you said, like, is compassion grounded in his nature? Well, all the evidence tells us it's not. I'm sorry. We're done. The argument's done. You have nowhere else to go from there. Like his nature is not compassionate. And so you can choose whether to call that good or evil, but the rest of us call it evil.
Yeah, and it's like I don't think these guys are really understanding what they're saying. Like, I mean, are they saying like because they're implying that like God could be the efficient cause of Hitler
Oh, I
murdering the Jews and be good? It's
yeah.
like, do you really understand what you're saying? Because I think if they were to just
No,
imagine what happened, they'd be like they'd be
I
considered.
absolutely, I think they understand what they're saying, and I think they know that it's bullshit. But they're creating this semantic game to try and make a problem go away
Yeah, cover all
to
the
keep people
bases.
in. Yeah, well, they're worried about hemorrhaging members, right? So they're not. This is not an argument they invented to convert people because outsiders are not going to buy this. It's bullshit. They recognize it immediately. But insiders are committed, right? So you can bullshit them. So if you can give them a bullshit reason that they can use to make these cognitive dissonances go away, that's what you do. So you come up with this sort of convoluted word game that feels okay. Like, oh, okay, it gives me permission to just forget this
Yeah.
problem and assume that it's solved and move on. And so I think that's why they use these weird words with weird definitions and this convoluted vocabulary and this whole structure about that. That's what they're doing, and I do think they're entirely aware of what they're doing.
Yeah, not to mention to add, to make things worse, like they both have PhDs, and two famous Calvinists gave, everything on in their book, a standing ovation. C. Stephen Evans and I think John C. Frame really liked what's in the book, so they got all this, hype and all these people
Yeah,
supporting him. So that's going to make it even
yeah,
worse. Oh, but anyone
yeah.
can just, we're
Argument.
trying to help
That's
out people to see through
argument
this.
from right. That's argument from prestige, right? They're using their degrees and their support and their peers to argue that they must be right because look how educated they are, look how much support they have, etc. Like that's a fallacious argument, but they are depending on that. That is part of the move.
Alrighty. Thank you for those answers, Richard. Alrighty, getting into our last question. So, for our final discussion, what evidence from a historical document or documents, say from ancient antiquity, from the time frame of about 0 AD to 100 AD, would it take to convince you, at least beyond any reasonable doubt, that something truly miraculous occurred?
Yeah, good question. And I talk about this in my book, Proving History, right? Where I bring up an example actually, and I'll use that example here. Now, of course, there is an issue that you have to resolve first. Is what do you mean by a miracle, right? Like, so, like, do we mean like evidence? Like, do we mean just something that defies physics, or do we mean something that defies physics that we can prove God did, right? Like, there's a difference. Like, trying to prove God did a thing is a much harder problem than trying to prove whether the thing happened. So let's set that aside. That's a separate question. There are super easy ways for that to be resolved, where God could just tell us, right? So the fact that he doesn't is a problem for people who want to argue for this.
I
If God was
presume.
still like talking, like you take like if the resurrected Jesus was still hanging around and I could go talk to him, Problem
Yeah.
solved, right? Like
Yeah.
it's right, you know what I mean? So like that's the thing. So but if we go to an example that I use in proving history, where we don't have that, we can't do that, but we can get enough evidence to believe something extraordinary happened that defies all known physics, and therefore we have to explain it in a way other than it's legend or exaggeration or made up or a con. And that's the darkness at Jesus's death. So in the Gospel of Mark, the sun goes out for 3 hours, and in Luke specifically calls it an eclipse of the sun that lasts 3 hours. Now, this is an eclipse of the sun during Passover, which is when you have a full moon, when it's not possible. Like a solar eclipse is impossible. Moreover, solar eclipses don't last 3 hours, right? So this is definitely no science can explain this. Like you could just dismiss it as like that's impossible, so we can just assume that's a made up story. And we have good reason to believe it's made up. Like we know, like attaching darknesses and eclipses to the deaths of heroes and kings was a trope at the time, right? So like that's not a problem. It's pulled out of scripture, etc. So there's a lot of like we can explain why Mark would make the story up. But what would it take for us to agree that that happened? That the sun went out for 3 hours during a full moon over Palestine, right? What would that take? And I document. I go through the list of what. Well, let's assume it happened, right? Let's assume that actually happened. The sun actually went out for 3 hours when it's impossible for that to have happened. Well, it would be recorded everywhere, right? Like so, like the Roman Empire is full of astronomers. In my book, The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire, I actually try to do some numbers. And in Science Education in the Early Roman Empire, I actually do a calculation in these two books where I try to calculate how many scientists were there. And the number is, over 100 in any generation, right? So you have basically dozens of astronomers who would definitely notice this, right? And it would be remarked upon. It would be in the astronomical records, like it would be in Ptolemy. There would be other records generated that would be preserved because of this. It would be all over that. We would also get evidence from other places. So, like Babylon had astronomers, so we would get independent attestation from the Babylonian archives that it happened. It would be possibly visible in China, so we would get some evidence from China. It probably wouldn't be visible in Mesoamerica, so we probably wouldn't get that. But the point being is we would get all this corroborating evidence from multiple independent primary sources, right? Like the Babylonians it would be in clay, the Romans it would be like multiply recorded in various places, to the point that it would be impossible for all of these people to claim that they observed this, especially experts, like because there are expert astronomers in China, in India, in Babylon, in Rome during all this time. It would be very, very improbable for all of them to have somehow colluded to document this thing having happened. So the probability of all those documents existing is very, very low, unless it really happened. And I think it's low enough that we should conclude. In that case, we would have to conclude that something happened. Like the sun went out for 3 hours. Was it some giant asteroid that passed in front of the sun? Was it like a gas cloud? Was it some sort of weird new physics? Or was it angels? Was it God? Like the question of what caused it would be a separate question that you have to pull in other evidence and so on to do. But just to document that it happened, that's what we would need. We would need evidence that is less probable than that's so improbable that it's less probable than the miracle itself happening, right? So, and that's what we would get in that case, right? Where it's actually so improbable that all that collusive evidence would exist, unless that really happened, that we would be able to confirm that it did happen. Then it'd be the question of explaining why, what caused it.
Yeah, one follow-up question. So, like, there's like some apologists like Vadi Bakum Jr. that will be like, hey, you can believe that Christ was seen by 500 witnesses because by the time Paul's talking about in, say, 50 something AD, no one we know of was going against that. But I'm like, that's like the same thing where like Muslims are in the Quran where it says, hey, the hour is coming, the moon is split, and then passerby saw the miracle and just dismissed it as a magic trick, a sleight of hand, and no one talked against the moon miracle, in the Quran. Like, I mean, so like, what do you think of that? Does that count as any evidence since no
Yeah.
one talks against it, and writes it down and says, hey, this is a bunch of bunk that is some evidence that the miracles occurred? What would you say to that?
Yeah, we can't argue from documents we don't have. And we have no documents from the critics of Christianity or even critics within Christianity, right? So, like, if anybody gainsaid that, we don't get to hear them. Like, their document wouldn't be preserved. Even if they wrote it down, we wouldn't get to hear it. So so yeah, we don't actually expect to hear that stuff. It would all be suppressed because the evidence is we have very limited, highly curated access to the evidence, so that's a problem. But I think it's more important to go back to where we started with this whole, like you mentioned, Josephus and stuff. We were talking about legends and things like that. When Paul says that, Paul repeatedly throughout his letters says these are revelations, these are psychological experiences inside yourself. Says I had a revelation of Jesus in me. It wasn't flesh and blood, it wasn't a man, etc. It was, this revelatory experience, which could be a dream or a waking vision. Both the same language applies to both, so we can't tell which is Paul is talking about. But for 500 or 100, let's just say a lot of people all at once, it wouldn't be a dream. It would be some sort of psychological experience of an ecstasy of all of them together. And but Paul doesn't say what it is, right? So and there's a lot of natural phenomena that it could be, right? So, and remember I went back to like the soldiers in the sky, right? Like oh yeah, there was some sort of amazing like solar effect with the clouds or something, and they read that as like a sign from God. And it's like people who see like a UFO, but it's just a weirdly shaped cloud, right? But then over time the story gets exaggerated into it was a UFO. It had lights. It was moving. Like all that stuff gets invented later. When Paul's writing, nothing has been invented yet because he's not telling you what they saw. So did they just have a feeling of the presence of Christ in themselves and saw dancing light in the sky, right? That was like the Fatima experience where it was just they were tricking themselves into seeing something that wasn't really there. Yeah, it's entirely possible. Like from what Paul tells us, there's no way to rule that out. So what Paul says is not even that big a deal. So like if that's, let's suppose that's what it was. It was just they saw lights in the sky, they felt the presence of Christ, and just convinced themselves that that was Jesus. Well, what if that happened? And then how would someone gainsay that, right? Like, what would you do? Like, I was like, well, I was there and I didn't see the light. Like, well, you'd have to have actually been there and you'd have to have not been part of the ecstasy that saw the light. And if you were there and didn't see the light, they would say, well, then obviously you don't have the eye of faith. Like, we all had the eye of faith. We all saw it together, right? So the critic would be excluded from a relevant category of observer, right? So like no matter what you did, like a gainsaying of it wouldn't do anything. And then you could even like have someone, let's say you had someone like Lucian of Samosata. Let's suppose he lived 100 years earlier and he investigated this. It's like this crazy story. And he went and talked to 100 different people and they all said, yeah, I saw this weird light in the sky and I felt the presence of Jesus. And you say, well, yeah, that's what they felt, but obviously it was just an internal psychological experience. So there's nothing to gainsay, right? So I think that's the reason why those kinds of arguments don't work, because when you look at how stories are actually told, how religious experience actually works globally, psychologically throughout the world and throughout history, that's not a valid argument, basically.
And you got to think of like the apparitions of the Virgin Mary, children of Fatima. Remember some skeptic organizations
Yeah,
talking about the children of Fatima. 3 children claimed to have seen the Virgin Mary, and there was even like
right.
stories and news reports around that time where like there was like bystanders that said that like they saw like a cloud ascend and like the Virgin Mary was on it. People other than the children of Fatima claimed to see some
Yeah.
supernatural apparition. You can just
And we
clearly
have
see
we have
embellishment occurring.
examples we have examples even in the Gospels, right? So you have the Emmaus narrative in Luke. There's a similar story in John. And even Matthew says some doubted, they like didn't believe that it was Jesus. And so the question, which suggests that there was a tradition of some people not buying it, right? So like, and so, but this means that, so like, let's take the Emmaus narrative. I think that's made up. It's fiction. It didn't happen. But let's suppose it did. This is what we hear. This is the story. So these two guys are walking along with this stranger, and he leaves, and they convince themselves that it was Jesus. And now they go around saying, Jesus appeared to us. He's risen from the grave. Okay. I mean, like in terms of what historically objectively happened, yeah, there's no miracle there, right? Like you met a guy, you just convinced yourself it was Jesus, and now you
It was
saw Jesus.
Elvis.
So there's nothing to gainsay, right? Other than the fact that that wasn't Jesus. Like I said, well, okay, you convinced yourself that was Jesus, but yeah, I'm not buying it. I don't think that was Jesus. It was just some guy. And so that's similar with Mary and the gardener, where Mary meets a gardener. She doesn't recognize him, and he says something to her, and then suddenly she thinks it's Jesus because whatever he says or whatever, and she remembers it differently of what he said, and it's like, oh, I had this experience of Jesus. It was Jesus, and someone objectively 20 feet away, like visiting another grave, would be looking like, no, it was just a gardener, and you didn't say that. Like, what? So
Yeah.
like you can explain these things by in a variety of ways that we know are well documented. This is why I mentioned, Joe Nickell and James Randi and Houdini and all these others who've done these studies. We know this. Like we know how urban legends develop. We know how they arise. We know how mundane events get exaggerated into miraculous events. We know how cons are perpetrated. We know how faith healing acts work. Like, oh, he healed the sick. And it's like, yeah, we have tons of that on video, but we've also investigated it and found that these are cons or they're just psychosomatic, right? So like just ordinary mundane things. They're not miracles. And so we have all that background knowledge. And when we apply it to the stories, when we have so little data, like what Paul gives us, you can't say it's more than that because it looks exactly like all the same stuff. Like the same stuff we found, all the other stuff didn't turn out to be true. And this is even less impressive than that stuff, right? So if you can't get behind that to say, oh no, but this one's real. This one, no, you need better evidence than that. Similar to, like I said, with the sun miracle that I just described.
Yeah, and it's like 2025, and people have been, praying to God and contemplating God, and he hasn't appeared or given any sign. And how long is this going to go on? Like the next 10,000 years is going to be like the
Yeah,
previous 10,000 years, and it's just going to be this way for eternity. Like there is no
yeah,
God. Atheism is true, plain and simple. I'm just saying, nothing's going to
yeah,
change. Ticks on a
yeah,
clock. Is it going to solve anything?
yeah, yeah.
Alrighty. Yep. Alrighty. Thank you again, Dr. Carrier, for an
Yeah, you bet.
excellent interview. And then, once this is downloaded, I'll send you the link. You can share it on
Yeah,
Twitter, share it with your friends and family, and tell
yeah,
everyone the great news
yeah. I'll,
about,
I'll share it
being
on
skeptical.
right, all my social media, which now is Facebook, Twitter, and Blue Sky. I'm really
Oh,
excited.
yeah. I think we were talking about that at the Internet Infidels Board of
Yeah,
Directors that
I
Jeff
held
Ladder might
off
have
for
a
the
blue
long
sky.
time. Right, I held off for the long time. Everybody's saying, "Oh, Mastodon, oh, Threads, whatever." But it's very clear that Blue Sky is going to inherit the mantle of Twitter because Blue Sky is basically Twitter that's not fucked up. So it's Twitter that actually works and does what it's supposed to do, and it's not meddled with, and so on. And you curate your own algorithm. It's just a better Twitter. And whereas Threads doesn't have that kind of feel or structure, Mastodon doesn't have the popularity. So I think ultimately it's going to be a Blue Sky, and that's the stats show that Blue Sky is now growing more than any other alternative. So that's why I'm getting ahead and getting in on that. I'll stick around on Twitter until it becomes completely impossible to remain on Twitter. But I think ultimately Twitter's in decline and it's Blue Sky here on out.
Awesome. Sounds good. All right. Thanks again, Dr. Carrier.
You bet.